The galaxy was old, and it was ruled by old powers. For 10,000 years, the Caldrician Empire had sat at the center of galactic politics, its fleets patrolling 1,000 star systems, its laws written into the bones of every species that wanted a seat at the Grand Assembly. The Assembly was the meeting place of all the great powers, a floating city of light above the dead star called Carneth Prime. There, the strong made the rules, and everyone else had to listen. Humanity had joined the Assembly only 40 years ago. In galactic terms, that was nothing. A blink, a single breath in the long life of the stars. Most of the older species still saw humans as children, loud and clumsy, too eager to speak before they understood the room. The Caldricians called them the young ones when they were being polite, and worse things when they were not. When humanity first arrived at the Assembly, the older species had been surprised, and then amused. Humans had come from a small blue planet on the edge of nowhere, a place so far from the galactic core that most star charts did not even bother to mark it. They had no history of fighting alongside the great powers. They had never helped end a war, never helped build a treaty, never done anything to earn respect. All they had was a strange hunger to learn fast, and a habit of asking questions nobody expected them to ask. The Assembly had a rule, one that had stood for thousands of years. It was called the Technological Restriction Accord. Under this rule, any species new to the Assembly was placed into a tier. The tier decided what technology that species was allowed to build, buy, or even study. New species were always placed in the lowest tier. They were given basic engines, basic shields, and basic weapons, just enough to defend a single home system, never enough to threaten anyone above them. Humanity had been placed in the lowest tier the day they joined, and there they had stayed. 40 years of asking to be reviewed, 40 years of being told to wait, 40 years of watching other species with less than half of humanity's population sail past them in the tier rankings, simply because their ambassadors knew the right people to smile at. Most humans had accepted this quietly, in public at least. In the halls of the Assembly, human ambassadors nodded and thanked the Council for their patience and understanding. They smiled the smiles that diplomats learn to wear like armor. But far away, past the orbit of Neptune, past the old warning buoys that marked the edge of explored human space, something else was happening, something the Assembly did not know about. It began in a place called Site Anvil. Site Anvil was not on any official star chart. It existed inside a hollowed-out asteroid, one of thousands drifting in the outer edge of the Sol system, in a region so cluttered with rock and ice and radiation that most sensors simply gave up trying to read it clearly. 20 years ago, a small team of human engineers and scientists had come to this asteroid with a plan that most of them believed would take a lifetime to finish. They were right. It had taken almost that long. Admiral Elena Voss stood in the command deck of Site Anvil, looking through a reinforced viewport at the shape resting inside the construction cradle beyond. She had been a young lieutenant when this project began. Her hair had been dark then. Now it carried streaks of gray, and her hands, though still steady, had learned the particular tiredness that comes from decades of secrets. The shape beyond the viewport was still not finished, but it no longer looked like a skeleton of metal beams. It had a hull now, dark and smooth, broken by long ridges that ran from bow to stern, like the spine of some great sleeping animal. It was larger than anything humanity had ever built. Larger, in fact, than most ships the Caldrician Empire itself used in open war. "Still can't believe we're actually going to finish it," said a voice behind her. Elena turned. Marcus Webb, the chief engineer of Site Anvil, walked up beside her, a tablet in one hand, and a cup of very old, very bad coffee in the other. Marcus had joined the project as a young engineer with wild ideas about drive systems nobody thought would work. 20 years later, half of those wild ideas were now built into the ship floating in front of them. "You said that same thing 10 years ago," Elena said. "And I meant it then too." Marcus took a sip of his coffee and made a face, the same face he always made, because the coffee at Site Anvil had never once been good. "Difference is, back then, we didn't have a working drive core. Now we do. Now it's just a matter of finishing the rest and hoping nothing blows up when we turn it on." Comforting. "I try." They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the workers in the distance. Small suited figures moving along the hull like insects on the back of a sleeping giant. Welding, checking, testing. Somewhere in the ship's belly, technicians were running diagnostics on systems that, if the assembly ever found out about them, would be called illegal 100 times over. The project had started with a simple, dangerous idea. If humanity could not be given better technology, humanity would have to build it themselves, quietly, far from assembly eyes, using whatever knowledge they could gather, buy, trade, or in some cases, simply invent from nothing. It had not been easy. The Technological Restriction Accord did not just limit weapons and shields. It limited entire branches of science. Human researchers were officially barred from studying certain kinds of energy manipulation, certain kinds of hull metallurgy, certain kinds of drive theory, all of it locked away behind assembly law and assembly inspectors who visited human shipyards twice a year to make sure nothing forbidden was being built. So Site Anvil had been built somewhere the inspectors never looked, and the scientists who worked there had not simply copied Caldrician designs. They could not. They did not have access to those designs, and even if they had, copying was not really humanity's strength. Humanity's strength, as it turned out, was doing the opposite of what everyone expected. Where the Caldricians built large, heavy warships with thick armor and slow, powerful engines, the humans of Site Anvil had built something built on speed, on strange new energy patterns, on ideas the older species had abandoned centuries ago because they thought those ideas were dead ends. They were not dead ends, they were simply harder. Command wants a full status report before the council session next month, Marcus said, breaking the silence. They're getting nervous, Reyes especially. Elena's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Ambassador Tomas Reyes. Reyes was humanity's senior representative at the assembly, a careful, patient man who had spent half his life smiling through insults so that humanity could keep its seat at the table. Elena respected him. She also knew that if the assembly ever discovered Site Anvil, it would be Reyes who had to stand in front of the council and somehow explain it, or somehow deny it, and either way it might cost humanity everything they had worked for. Tell Command the ship will be ready within the year, Elena said. Weapons systems are behind schedule, but the hull and drive are close to final testing. If the core holds during the next set of trials, we'll have a warship that can outmatch anything in the Caldrician Third Fleet. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You really believe that? I have to, Elena said quietly. Because if this doesn't work, humanity stays in the lowest tier forever, and I don't think we can survive forever like this. She was not exaggerating. In the last 5 years, tensions along the edge of human space had grown worse. Caldrician patrol ships had begun straying closer to human colonies, testing borders, testing patience. Twice, human trade vessels had been stopped and searched without warning, their crews questioned for hours before being allowed to continue. Officially, the Empire called these routine security checks. Unofficially, everyone on the human side of the assembly understood exactly what they were. Warnings, small, careful reminders of who held the power in this part of the galaxy. The Empire did not fear humanity. Why would they? Humanity had one home system, a handful of colonies, and a fleet made up mostly of unarmed cargo haulers and lightly armed patrol boats that could barely defend against pirates, let alone an imperial warship. To the Caldricians, humans were an amusing new addition to the assembly, useful for trade, entertaining in their stubbornness, but not a threat. Not something worth worrying about. That was exactly what Elena was counting on. Far above Site Anvil, in the dark, quiet space between the asteroids, a lone sensor drone drifted, one of hundreds scattered around the hidden shipyard, to watch for approaching ships. It had been doing this job for 20 years without incident. Today, its sensors picked up something new, a faint energy signature, moving slowly through the asteroid field from the direction of Caldrician space. The drone sent a silent alert back to Site Anvil. In the command deck, an alarm chirped softly. Elena and Marcus both turned toward the display as a technician called out, Admiral, we have an unidentified contact. Small craft, low power signature, moving through Sector 9. It's on a course that could bring it within scanning range of the outer shipyard perimeter. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Caldrician? Signature's a partial match to their long-range scout drones, the technician said. Could be a routine patrol. Could be something else. Marcus set down his coffee. 20 years. And now, of all times, someone decides to go exploring out here? Elena did not answer right away. She watched the blinking dot on the display, so small and so far away, and yet suddenly, the most important thing in the entire star system. Bring the shipyard to silent status, she said finally. Full power dampening. I want every system that isn't life support running at minimum. If that drone gets close enough to see what we're building here, everything we've worked for is finished before it even begins. The order went out immediately. Across Site Anvil, lights dimmed. Non-essential systems shut down one by one. Outside, the workers on the hull froze in place, watching for the signal to retreat into the asteroid's hidden bays. The great dark shape of the unfinished warship sat silent and still, its long ridged hull barely visible now against the blackness of space, waiting, like the rest of them, to see whether its secret would survive one more day. Elena stood at the viewport, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the tiny blinking light that represented the approaching drone. 20 years of secrecy had come down to this single moment. If the drone turned away, they would have more time. If it did not, the Caldrician Empire would learn, far sooner than anyone wanted, that the young ones of humanity had been building something in the dark that no one in the galaxy thought they were capable of building at all. The silence in the command deck stretched on, broken only by the quiet hum of dampened engines and the steady beeping of the tracking display. Marcus stood beside Elena, his earlier humor gone completely now, replaced by the same tight focus that had carried them through 20 years of setbacks, failures, and slow, careful progress. "Come on," he whispered, almost to himself. "Turn around, turn around." The drone continued on its course, drifting closer to the edge of the asteroid field that hid Site Anvil from the rest of the galaxy. On the display, its distance ticked down, meter by meter, kilometer by kilometer, closer to the boundary that no outsider had ever crossed in 20 years of careful, quiet work. Elena did not move. She had learned long ago that panic solved nothing, that the only thing to do in moments like this was watch, wait, and trust the plans they had built for exactly this situation. Site Anvil was hidden well. The asteroid field was thick with natural interference. The odds were still in their favor. But odds, as she well knew, were not guarantees. And somewhere out there, in the cold dark of space between two very different powers, a small, silent drone continued on its path, carrying with it the fate of everything humanity had built in secret over the last 20 years, and the fate of the warship that, one day soon, would either save humanity's place among the stars or bring the full weight of the Caldrician Empire down upon it before it ever had the chance to fly. The drone turned away. It happened slowly, almost lazily, as if the machine had simply lost interest in whatever faint readings it had picked up near the edge of the asteroid field. On the display, the small blinking dot curved back the way it had come, retreating toward Caldrician space, at the same slow, steady pace it had arrived. Elena watched it go for a full minute before she let herself breathe. "Sensors confirm it's leaving the sector," the technician said. "No indication it detected the shipyard." Marcus let out a long breath and picked his coffee back up, even though it was now completely cold. "That," he said, "is enough excitement for 1 decade." Elena did not smile, not yet. "Keep the shipyard on silent status for another 6 hours. I want to be certain before we go back to normal operations." She turned to the technician. "And get me a full report on that drone's flight path. I want to know if this was random, or if someone sent it here on purpose." It took 2 days to get an answer, and when it came, it was not the answer anyone wanted. The report arrived from human intelligence assets working quietly inside assembly space, people whose job it was to listen carefully to conversations at the edges of Caldrician diplomatic circles and pass along anything useful. According to the report, the scout drone had not been sent specifically toward Site Anvil. It had been part of a wider Caldrician patrol sweep, a routine expansion of monitoring along the border near human territory. But the reason for that expanded patrol was what worried Elena. Caldrician military command had grown suspicious, not of Site Anvil specifically, They did not know it existed, but of humanity in general. Reports had reached the empire of unusual resource shipments moving through human space over the last several years. Rare metals, specialized alloys, components that, on their own, meant very little, but together, to someone paying close enough attention, might suggest a pattern. "They're not onto us," Marcus said, reading the same report over Elena's shoulder in her office 3 days later. "Not exactly, but they're starting to ask questions. And once the Empire starts asking questions, they don't usually stop until they get answers." "I know," Elena said. She rubbed her eyes, feeling the weight of every one of the last 20 years settle onto her shoulders at once, which means our timeline just got shorter. The warship, still unnamed in any official record, though the engineers who worked on it had taken to calling it simply the Ghost because of how easily it seemed to vanish into shadow and static on any sensor sweep, was close to completion. But close was not finished. The drive core was stable. The hull was complete. But the weapons systems, the systems that would actually let this ship fight and win against an Imperial warship, were still months away from being fully tested. Months, Elena now suspected, they might not have. Far away, at the heart of the Grand Assembly above Carnith Prime, Ambassador Tomas Reyes sat in a private meeting room, listening to a Caldrician counselor named Osirin speak in the smooth, unhurried tone that all senior Caldrician officials seemed to learn as part of their training. "We simply wish to understand," Osirin said, his long fingers folded together on the table between them, "why a species in the lowest technological tier requires such large quantities of tantrium alloy and phase-stable crystal lattice. These are not materials your people typically use, Ambassador. One might almost think you were building something." Reyes kept his expression perfectly calm, though his heart had begun beating faster the moment Osirin said the word building. "Counselor, humanity has been expanding its mining operations in the outer colonies," Reyes said smoothly. "New refineries require new materials. I assure you, there is nothing unusual happening in human space beyond ordinary economic growth." Osirin studied him for a long moment, the way a predator studies something it has not yet decided is worth chasing. "Of course, Ambassador. I am sure you are correct." He did not sound sure at all. "Still, the Grand Marshal has requested increased patrols along the border. A precaution, nothing more. I trust your people will not find this inconvenient." "Of course not," Reyes said. "Humanity has nothing to hide." The words tasted like ash in his mouth as he said them, but he had learned long ago that a good lie, delivered calmly, was often the only shield a small power had against a much larger one. When the meeting ended, Reyes left the chamber and immediately sent an encrypted message back to Earth, marked for Elena's eyes only. It contained a single line: "They are watching us more closely than before. We need to move faster, or we need to be more careful. Perhaps both." Back at Site Anvil, the message arrived just as Elena was walking the length of the ship's main hangar, watching engineers install the last of the ship's forward weapon housings. The Ghost's true name, the one that would eventually be painted along its hull, had been chosen only recently, after months of arguments among the crew about what a ship like this deserved to be called. They had settled on Voidbreaker. It was, Elena thought, a fitting name. This ship had been built entirely in the dark, entirely in secret, entirely against the expectations of a galaxy that had told humanity, again and again, that it did not belong among the great powers. If Voidbreaker ever had to fight, it would do so exactly the way it had been built, appearing suddenly, without warning, breaking through the darkness that had hidden it for so long. She read Reyes's message twice, then called Marcus and the rest of her senior staff into the command deck for an emergency meeting. "The Empire is getting suspicious," she told them, laying out everything the intelligence report had revealed. "We no longer have the luxury of a slow, careful timeline. I want weapons testing accelerated. I want drive trials moved up. And I want a full defensive plan in place, in case Caldrician forces ever do find this shipyard before we're ready. Accelerating weapons testing means taking risks we haven't taken before," said Chief Weapons Officer Dara Okafor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had spent the last decade designing Voidbreaker's main armament from concepts most assembly engineers considered outdated and useless. "Our plasma lance array has only been tested in simulation. If we fire it in real conditions before we're fully ready, there's a chance it could damage the ship's own hull. Then we test it carefully, Elena said. But we test it soon. Over the following weeks, Site Anvil transformed. What had once been a slow, methodical project became something closer to a race against time. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock. Testing schedules that had once stretched across months were compressed into weeks. Marcus barely slept, running diagnostics on the drive core late into every night. Determined that if Voidbreaker was going to fly sooner than planned, it would not fail because of something he could have caught. The first full weapons test took place 40 days after the scout drone incident, in a remote stretch of space far from any trade routes, chosen specifically because no one, human or otherwise, was likely to be watching. Elena stood on the bridge of Voidbreaker for the very first time as its systems came online, not the command deck of Site Anvil, but the actual bridge of the ship itself, a wide, curved room lined with display screens and control stations, still smelling faintly of fresh metal and sealant. It was, she realized, the first time in 20 years that she had stood inside the thing she had spent her entire career building. Drive core stable, Marcus reported from his station. All primary systems online. Weapons array charging. Target drone deployed, Dara added. Distance, 400 kilometers. Elena took a slow breath. Fire when ready. What happened next would later become one of the most closely guarded secrets in human military history. Voidbreaker's forward plasma lance array activated, drawing power directly from the ship's drive core in a way no assembly-approved weapon system had ever been designed to do. A beam of raw, concentrated energy tore across the 400 kilometers of empty space in less than a second, striking the target drone dead center. The drone did not simply take damage, it ceased to exist. On the bridge, there was a long moment of stunned silence. Confirmed target destruction, Dara finally said, her voice quiet with something between awe and disbelief. Complete disintegration, no debris field, just gone. Marcus stared at his readouts, then looked up at Elena, a slow grin spreading across his tired face. Admiral, he said, I don't think there's a ship in the Caldrician fleet that could survive a direct hit from that. Elena allowed herself, for the first time in 20 years, a small, genuine smile. Good, she said, because we're going to need every advantage we can get. But even as the crew of Voidbreaker celebrated their success, far across the galaxy, another set of eyes had noticed something. A different Caldrician scout, patrolling far beyond its assigned route, had picked up a faint, strange energy reading. A burst of power unlike anything in its records, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, from a sector of space that, according to every star chart the Empire possessed, should have contained nothing but empty vacuum and drifting rock. The scout captain filed a report, marked it as an anomaly worth investigating, and sent it up the chain of command. It would take time for that report to reach anyone important, but it would reach someone eventually. And when it did, the questions that Counselor Osiran had already begun asking Ambassador Reyes would only grow louder, sharper, and far more dangerous for the secret that Site Anvil had worked 20 years to protect. Grand Marshal Threx Valor did not like reports that made no sense. He sat in his private office aboard the Imperial flagship Dominion's Wrath, reading the same scout report for the third time. A burst of unexplained energy, detected in a supposedly empty sector near the edge of human space, powerful enough to register on long-range sensors from 400 kilometers away, then gone completely, as if it had never happened at all. No follow-up readings, no debris, no explanation. Threx had commanded Caldrician fleets for over 300 years. In that time, he had learned that strange, unexplained things rarely stayed unexplained for long, and they were almost never as harmless as they first appeared. He set the report down and called for his aide. Send this to Imperial Intelligence, he said, and increase patrol density along the human border sector by 20%. I want eyes on every corner of that region. Sir, the Assembly's diplomatic office has cautioned against provoking incidents with newer member species, his aide reminded him carefully, especially given the recent complaints from the human ambassador about excessive patrol activity. Threx's expression did not change. The humans can complain all they like. Something happened in that sector, and I intend to find out what. Back at Site Anvil, Elena Voss received word of the increased Caldrician patrols 3 days later, delivered through the same careful intelligence channels that had warned her before. This time, the news was worse. The patrols were not simply passing through human space anymore. They were actively searching, moving in tighter, more organized patterns, exactly the kind of behavior a fleet used when it was hunting for something specific. They felt the weapons test, Marcus said grimly, standing in Elena's office with a tablet full of the latest intelligence data. There's no other explanation. That energy spike from the plasma lance, it must have registered further than we thought. Elena stared at the star map on her wall, at the small cluster of dots representing the expanding Caldrician search pattern, slowly creeping closer to the outer edge of the asteroid field that hid Site Anvil. How long until they reach this sector? At their current search rate? Marcus checked his tablet. 3 weeks, maybe less. 3 weeks. It was not enough time to finish everything Elena had hoped to finish. Voidbreaker's weapon systems were tested and functional, but the ship's defensive shields were still running at only 60% of their planned capacity. The secondary engines, meant to give the ship extra maneuverability in close combat, had not yet completed their trials. There were 100 small things still unfinished, 100 systems still being refined, and now, suddenly, there was no more time to refine them. We have 2 choices, Elena said finally. We finish what we can in 3 weeks, and prepare Voidbreaker for its first real test, far sooner than planned. Or we abandon Site Anvil, disperse the crew, and hope we can hide the project somewhere else before the Empire finds us. 20 years of work, Marcus said quietly. We can't just abandon it. I know, Elena's voice was firm, which means we finish what we can, and we prepare Voidbreaker to fly, ready or not. Over the following days, Site Anvil worked harder than it ever had before. Every engineer, every technician, every single person on the project understood exactly what was at stake. If the Caldrician search pattern reached the shipyard before Voidbreaker was ready to defend itself, 20 years of secret work, and the only real chance humanity had to change its standing in the galaxy, would be destroyed in a matter of hours. Ambassador Reyes, meanwhile, worked a different kind of battle back at the assembly. He requested a private meeting with Counselor Osirin, hoping to slow the Caldrician search before it reached its target. Counselor, I must formally protest the increased patrol activity along our border, Reyes said, keeping his voice calm and measured, despite the tension coiled tight in his chest. Human trade vessels have reported delays, harassment, and unnecessary searches. This behavior is damaging our economy and violating the spirit of cooperation this assembly was built upon. Osirin's expression remained pleasant, unreadable. I understand your concerns, Ambassador. However, the Grand Marshal has detected unusual activity near your territory. Surely you can understand our need to investigate anything that might threaten Assembly security. Unusual activity, Reyes repeated carefully. What kind of activity exactly? That, Osirin said, is precisely what we intend to find out. Reyes left the meeting with no real answers, and a growing sense of dread. He sent word to Elena immediately. They will not stop searching. Whatever you need to do it quickly. I cannot hold them back much longer. 9 days later, the crisis Elena had feared arrived far sooner than expected. A Caldrician patrol squadron, 3 light cruisers and a scout ship, entered the outer edge of the asteroid field surrounding Site Anvil, far earlier than the projected 3-week timeline had suggested. Whether this was because the search pattern had simply moved faster than predicted, or because Imperial intelligence had found some new clue pointing them directly toward this sector, no one at Site Anvil knew for certain. What mattered was that they were here, now, and Voidbreaker was still not fully ready. Admiral, Patrol Squadron is moving through Sector 7, the sensor technician reported, urgency sharpening her voice. They're sweeping in a standard search pattern. At their current course, they'll reach the outer perimeter of the shipyard within 6 hours. Elena stood at the command deck, every instinct telling her this was the moment 20 years of careful secrecy had been building toward, whether she was ready for it or not. Options, she said, turning to her senior staff. We could maintain silent status and hope they pass without detecting us, suggested Dara. It's worked before. Against a single scout drone on a routine sweep, Yes, Marcus said. Not against a dedicated search squadron actively looking for anomalies. If they're running deep scan sensors, silent status might not be enough to hide an entire shipyard and an unfinished warship. Elena looked out at Voidbreaker, still resting in its construction cradle, still connected to a dozen support systems that would take hours to properly disconnect. Flying the ship now, in its current state, was a risk. Not flying it, and letting the Caldrician squadron discover Site Anvil, was a far greater one. Prepare Voidbreaker for emergency launch, she said. If they find this shipyard, I want us ready to move the ship somewhere they can't follow, or to defend it if we have no other choice. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity. Engineers rushed to disconnect Voidbreaker from its support cradle. Weapons crews ran final checks on systems that had only been tested once, weeks earlier, against a single unarmed drone. Elena moved from station to station, watching every readout, every status update, trying to prepare her people for a fight none of them had ever expected to face this soon. At the 4-hour mark, the Caldrician squadron's scout ship broke away from the main group, moving directly toward the section of the asteroid field where Site Anvil's outer sensor drones were positioned. They're heading straight for our perimeter, the sensor technician reported, her voice tight. I don't think this is random anymore, Admiral. I think they know something's out here. Elena's hands tightened on the edge of her console. 20 years of secrecy, hanging by a thread. All hands, final launch preparations. We may not have a choice about when Voidbreaker first flies. On the bridge of the Caldrician scout ship, a young lieutenant named Vesk stared at his sensor display, frowning at readings that made no sense. Faint energy traces, scattered across a wide section of the asteroid field, patterns too structured to be natural, too subtle to be an obvious base, but undeniably present if you knew how to look for them. Captain, Vesk said, I'm reading multiple faint energy signatures throughout this sector. Could be mineral deposits, could be something else. The scout ship's captain, an older, weathered officer named Grendal, leaned over the display, studying the same readings. Increase sensor sensitivity, move us closer. The scout ship adjusted course, drifting deeper into the asteroid field, closer to the hidden entrance of Site Anvil than any outside vessel had come in 20 years. Somewhere ahead, hidden inside a hollowed-out asteroid, an entire secret shipyard held its breath, and a warship the galaxy did not know existed, prepared, for the first time, to reveal itself. Not on humanity's own timeline, but on the edge of discovery, with an Imperial scout ship closing in, and no more time left to hide. The Caldrician scout ship drifted through the asteroid field, its sensors sweeping every rock and shadow, searching for the source of the strange energy readings that had drawn it here. Lieutenant Vesk watched his display carefully, adjusting the scan angle again and again, trying to pin down exactly where the signals were strongest. There, he said suddenly, pointing at a cluster of larger asteroids ahead. Readings are concentrated around that formation, Captain. Captain Grendel studied the cluster through the forward viewport. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than an ordinary collection of drifting rock, the kind found by the thousands throughout this remote system. But something about the pattern of the readings bothered him. Too regular, too consistent. Bring us closer, he ordered. Slow approach. I want a full sensor sweep before we report anything back to the fleet. Inside Site Anvil, the command deck had gone completely silent, except for the low hum of dampened systems and the quiet, tense breathing of everyone watching the display. The Caldrician scout ship was now less than 2 kilometers from the hidden entrance to the shipyard, close enough that even careful concealment might not be enough to hide the truth much longer. Admiral, Marcus said quietly, Voidbreaker's launch sequence is ready. Say the word, and we can have her clear of the cradle in 90 seconds. Elena stared at the approaching scout ship on the display, weighing every option in the span of a few racing heartbeats. If they launched now, the scout ship would almost certainly detect the massive energy surge of Voidbreaker's drive core activating, revealing everything instantly. But if they waited, and the scout ship discovered the shipyard's hidden entrance on its own, they would lose any chance of controlling how this moment unfolded. There was no perfect option left, only choices and consequences. Hold position, Elena said. Let's see if they find the entrance on their own, or if they lose interest and move on. For a long, agonizing minute, the scout ship continued its slow approach, sensors sweeping across the surface of the asteroid cluster. Then, without warning, it stopped, hovering at the very edge of the concealed entrance, close enough that its sensors would surely catch the artificial edges hidden beneath layers of rock camouflage. "Captain," Vesk said, his voice suddenly sharp with excitement, "I'm reading an artificial structure beneath the asteroid surface. This isn't natural rock. There's a hidden facility here." Grendel's eyes widened. "Record everything. Prepare to send a full report back to the fleet immediately." On the command deck of Site Anvil, the sensor technician's voice cracked with tension. "Admiral, they've found the entrance. They're preparing to transmit." Elena's decision came instantly, without hesitation. 20 years of secrecy had just run out, and there was no more use pretending otherwise. "Launch Voidbreaker," she said. "Full power. Disable that scout ship's communications before it can send anything back to the Empire." Alarms blared softly throughout Site Anvil, as the massive hidden doors of the shipyard's main hangar began to open. Voidbreaker's drive core, already primed and ready, surged to full power, filling the ship's long dark hull with light for the very first time in its 20-year existence. Slowly, then with gathering speed, the great warship began to move, sliding free of the asteroid that had hidden it for 2 decades, out into open space. On the bridge of the Caldrician scout ship, Lieutenant Vesk's sensor display suddenly lit up with an alert so severe he nearly fell out of his seat. "Captain! Massive energy signature. Directly ahead. Something is emerging from the asteroid." Grendel turned toward the forward viewport just in time to see it. The Voidbreaker emerged from the hidden entrance like something out of a nightmare, a warship far larger than anything Grendel had expected to find in human territory, its dark hull catching the distant starlight along ridges that ran the length of its massive frame, weapon ports glowing faintly as targeting systems came online. That's not possible," Grendel whispered. "The humans don't have ships like this. Their technology tier doesn't allow." He never finished the sentence. Voidbreaker's forward point defense systems fired a precise, controlled burst directly at the scout ship's communication array, destroying it instantly, without touching the rest of the hull. The scout ship rocked violently from the impact, alarms screaming throughout its interior. "Communications are down," Vesk shouted. "We can't transmit anything." "Evasive maneuvers," Grendel ordered, gripping his console as the scout ship banked hard away from the massive warship bearing down on them. "Get us out of this sector now." But Voidbreaker was not finished. Elena, standing on the bridge with her hands steady despite the pounding of her own heart, gave the order that would change everything. "Disable their engines. I want that ship stopped, not destroyed. We need to control what happens next." Dara's hands moved across her weapons console with practiced precision, honed through months of simulations that had finally, in this single terrifying moment, become real. A second burst of precisely targeted fire struck the scout ship's engine section, disabling its drive without breaching the hull. The scout ship went dark, drifting powerless in space, its crew alive but trapped, utterly unable to run or fight or warn anyone of what they had just witnessed. On the command deck of Site Anvil, and on the bridge of Voidbreaker itself, a strange, heavy silence settled over everyone present. 20 years of secrecy had ended, in the space of about 90 seconds. There was no going back now. "Admiral," Marcus said quietly, "what do we do with them?" Elena looked at the disabled scout ship on the display, thinking through the tangled, dangerous consequences of every choice available to her. Destroying the ship and its crew would eliminate the immediate witnesses, but it would also mark humanity as an aggressor the moment the truth eventually came out, and it always did, eventually. Letting them go meant the Caldrician Empire would learn the truth immediately, on humanity's terms rather than the Empire's. But at least it meant humanity would not begin this new chapter of its history with blood on its hands. "Recover the crew," Elena said finally. "Treat them well. We're not going to start this the way the Empire expects us to." Voidbreaker moved carefully alongside the disabled scout ship, extending docking clamps that had been designed for exactly this kind of situation, though no one had ever expected to use them so soon. A small team of human marines boarded the crippled vessel, moving through its dark corridors with careful, controlled discipline, finding Grendel, Vesk, and the rest of the scout ship's small crew waiting for them, weapons lowered, clearly understanding that resistance against a ship like Voidbreaker would accomplish nothing. Grendel, brought aboard Voidbreaker under careful guard, stood in stunned silence as he was led through the warship's interior, staring at systems and technology that, according to everything the Empire had ever told him about humanity, simply should not exist. "How," he finally managed to say, as Elena met him personally in one of Voidbreaker's secure holding areas, "is this possible? Your species was placed in the lowest technological tier. Your ships are supposed to be primitive. This is more advanced than half the Imperial fleet." Elena studied the Caldrician captain for a long moment before answering. "We were told the same thing you were, Captain, that humanity wasn't capable of building anything like this. We decided the Empire was wrong." Grendel said nothing, but the look in his eyes carried a message Elena understood clearly. Fear, not of her, not personally, but of what this discovery meant for everything the Empire believed about its own place at the top of galactic power. Back on the bridge, Marcus approached Elena quietly. "Their fleet will notice the scout ship's silence eventually. When they do, they'll send more ships to investigate. We have maybe a day, 2 at most, before this sector is crawling with Imperial warships." Elena nodded slowly, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Then we don't wait for them to come looking. We contact the Assembly directly. Ambassador Reyes needs to know what's happened here, immediately, and the Empire needs to hear the truth from us, on our terms, before their own fears and assumptions write a different story." She turned to look out at the vast darkness of space beyond Voidbreaker's viewport, at the distant stars that marked the boundary between human territory and the wider galaxy beyond. 20 years of secrecy had ended tonight, not with the slow, careful reveal Elena had once hoped for, but with a sudden, unavoidable collision between hidden ambition and imperial suspicion. There was no more hiding now. The galaxy was about to learn exactly what humanity had built in the shadows, and exactly what it meant for a species the Empire had always called too small, too young, and too primitive to ever be a real threat. Somewhere far across the stars, aboard the Dominion's Wrath, Grand Marshal Threx Valor would soon receive a report unlike anything in 300 years of his long military career. A report that would shake the confidence of the entire Caldrician Empire, and force a galaxy built on old certainties to face a very new, very uncomfortable truth. Ambassador Tomas Reyes received Elena's message in the middle of the night, assembly time, and read it twice before he fully understood what it meant. 20 years of careful secrecy ended in a single encounter at the edge of human space. A Caldrician scout ship disabled, its crew captured, unharmed, and treated with respect, and a warship, larger and more advanced than anything humanity was supposed to be capable of building, now sitting in open space, its existence no longer a secret to anyone who mattered. He sat alone in his quarters for several minutes, staring at the message, feeling the weight of a decision that was no longer his to make, slowly settle onto his shoulders anyway. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and did the only thing that made sense. He requested an emergency session of the Grand Assembly. The request caused immediate confusion among Assembly staff. Emergency sessions were rare, reserved for crises that threatened the stability of the entire galactic order. No one expected such a request from the human delegation, a group known for its careful, patient diplomacy, not its dramatic gestures. When Reyes stood before the full Assembly Council 12 hours later, the chamber was tense with whispered speculation. Caldrician representatives sat near the front, Councillor Osirin among them, watching Reyes with sharp, curious eyes. Grand Marshal Threx Valor himself had been summoned to attend, standing at the edge of the chamber in full military dress, having received the report of his missing scout ship only hours before. "Members of the Assembly," Reyes began, his voice steady despite the enormous pressure of the moment. "I come before you to share information that I know will be difficult to hear, and difficult to accept. 20 years ago, having exhausted every reasonable diplomatic avenue to have our technological restrictions reviewed, humanity made the decision to develop advanced military technology independently, outside of Assembly oversight." A ripple of shocked murmurs spread across the chamber. Threx's expression darkened, though he said nothing yet, waiting to hear the rest. This was not a decision we made lightly, Reyes continued. For decades, humanity has watched species with far less experience, far less unity, and far smaller populations advance through the technological tiers, while our own requests for review were repeatedly delayed or denied. We came to believe, rightly or wrongly, that our continued safety and our continued place among the great powers of this galaxy depended on our ability to defend ourselves, on our own terms. You are describing a direct violation of the Technological Restriction Accord, Ossurin said sharply, rising from his seat. An accord that every member species, including humanity, agreed to uphold. Yes, Reyes said simply, we did. And I will not stand here and pretend otherwise. But I would ask this assembly to consider why that accord exists in the first place, and whether it has truly served its purpose of maintaining peace, or whether it has simply maintained an old hierarchy that benefits those already at the top. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices, delegates from a dozen species all speaking at once, some outraged, some curious, some clearly calculating what this revelation might mean for their own position in the galactic order. It took several minutes for the assembly's presiding officer to restore order. Grand Marshal Threx finally spoke, his voice cutting through the noise with the weight of 300 years of military authority. Ambassador, one of my scout ships entered human territory and has not reported back in over a day. Are you telling this assembly that your people have taken hostile action against Imperial forces? Reyes met his gaze steadily. The scout ship you speak of was disabled, not destroyed, Grand Marshal. Its crew is alive, unharmed, and being treated with full respect and care, aboard the very warship they discovered. Humanity had every justification to view an armed vessel probing a hidden research facility as a hostile act. We chose restraint instead. Threx's jaw tightened, though something in his expression shifted slightly. Not quite respect, but something close to reluctant acknowledgement.
And this warship?
How advanced is it precisely? Reyes hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. Advanced enough, Grand Marshal, that I am told your scout ship's crew described it as more capable than most vessels in your empire's active fleet. The silence that followed was heavier than any of the shouting before it. Far away, aboard Voidbreaker, Elena watched a live feed of the assembly session with Marcus and Dara beside her, all three of them tense with the knowledge that the outcome of this moment would decide everything humanity had worked toward for 2 decades. They're not going to just let this go, Dara said quietly. Even if they don't attack us directly, there will be sanctions, punishments. They can't allow a species in the lowest tier to simply build a warship and get away with it. It would set a precedent every other restricted species might follow. Elena nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the display. That's exactly why Reyes needs to change what this looks like. Not a violation to be punished, a wake-up call to be answered. Back in the assembly chamber, Reyes pressed forward, sensing the moment required more than just confession. It required a case, a reason, an argument the entire galaxy could understand. Members of the assembly, I ask you to consider this. Humanity did not build this warship to conquer, to threaten, or to expand beyond our own borders. We built it because we watched Imperial patrols grow more aggressive along our territory year after year, because we watched our economy suffer under trade restrictions we had no voice in setting, because we came to believe, fairly or not, that this assembly had forgotten what it means to treat a smaller power with genuine respect rather than simple tolerance. He paused, letting his words settle over the chamber before continuing. I do not ask this assembly to forgive our actions without consequence. I ask this assembly to use this moment as an opportunity to finally, honestly review the technological tier system that has kept newer species locked in place for far longer than reasonable safety requires. Humanity is willing to accept appropriate consequences for our actions, but we are also asking, clearly and directly, for this assembly to demonstrate that a species can prove itself capable and be treated accordingly, rather than being judged forever by the year it happened to join this assembly. The debate that followed lasted nearly 6 hours. Delegates argued, negotiated, threatened, and reconsidered. Several older species, long comfortable in their high-tier positions, argued strongly for severe punishment, fearful of what precedent leniency might set. But several newer, smaller species, many of whom had quietly resented the same restrictions humanity had faced, spoke unexpectedly in humanity's defense, seeing in this moment a chance for change that might benefit them as well. In the end, no full agreement was reached that day, but a resolution was passed, narrowly, calling for an immediate and thorough review of the entire Technological Restriction Accord, along with a formal, supervised assessment of humanity's demonstrated capabilities, an assessment that, given what Voidbreaker had already proven, seemed unlikely to end with humanity remaining in the lowest tier much longer. Grand Marshal Threx requested, and was granted, a formal meeting with Elena Voss herself 3 days later, aboard a neutral assembly vessel positioned at the border of human and Caldrician space. They met in a quiet, simple room, just the two of them, and a small security detail from each side. Threx studied Elena carefully as she entered, this human woman who had spent 20 years of her life building something the entire Empire had believed impossible. "You disabled one of my ships without destroying it," Threx said, by way of greeting. "You could have killed my crew. You chose not to." "We're not interested in starting a war, Grand Marshal," Elena said. "We're interested in being treated as equals. There's a difference." Threx studied her for a long moment. 300 years I have served this empire," he said finally. "In that time, I have seen many species join this assembly, and I have seen how quickly most of them settle into the roles they are given, whether those roles are fair or not. Your species did not settle. I confess, I find that noteworthy." "Is that a compliment, Grand Marshal?" "It is an observation," Threx said, though something in his tone suggested it was closer to respect than he was willing to openly admit. "The Empire will not forget what happened here. Some among my people will call for retaliation. Others will call this proof that humanity cannot be trusted. But I suspect, in time, most will simply come to understand that your species has earned something it did not have before." "And what's that?" "Attention," Threx said simply. "The kind that is difficult to ignore and impossible to dismiss." In the months that followed, the Assembly's review of the Technological Restriction Accord moved slowly, as these things always did, filled with careful negotiations, cautious compromises, and no small amount of continued suspicion from species unwilling to easily accept a shift in the old order. But it moved forward nonetheless. And humanity, for the first time in 40 years, found itself being listened to at the negotiating table, not dismissed. Voidbreaker remained humanity's greatest secret turned greatest asset, a warship whose very existence had forced an ancient, powerful empire to reconsider assumptions it had held for thousands of years. Site Anvil, no longer hidden, became the foundation of humanity's first official shipyard program, openly building a small fleet of vessels based on the lessons learned during 2 decades of secret development. Elena Voss stood once more at the viewport of the command deck, now converted into the headquarters of humanity's new Defense Fleet Command, watching Voidbreaker rest in its berth, no longer hidden in shadow, no longer a secret waiting to be discovered. 20 years, Marcus said, standing beside her as he so often had. "Hard to believe it's finally out in the open." "It's not finally over," Elena said. "It's finally beginning." Far above them, among the stars that had once told humanity it did not belong, a new chapter of galactic history was quietly taking shape. One built not on humanity's smallness or humanity's patience, but on the simple, undeniable fact that when the galaxy said humans could not build something extraordinary, humanity had built it anyway, and had emerged from the void to prove every single doubter wrong. The Caldrician Empire would never look at humanity the same way again, and humanity, having finally earned its place among the stars through its own hands and its own will, had no intention of ever going back into the shadows again.